We've really got two great folks coming up who work on this every day. We're going to get more specific about some of the ideas that we're working with, both in Decatur, in Atlanta, in our region, in the state, and in the country. So let me go ahead and get the introductions done. I first want to introduce Sarah Kirsch, who's the Executive Director of ULI, Urban Land Institute, Atlanta. It's one of the largest and most active district councils of ULI in the country. And one of the great things about having a ULI is that they have offices throughout the country and they have data throughout the country. So if we're working in the Atlanta region, we're going to pay attention to a Dallas or a Denver or a Houston, places that's similar to us, and see what those trends are and learn from them, and then they learn from us. ULI provides leadership in as responsible use of land and creating and sustaining thriving communities. You heard me this morning reference a process that we've been in Atlanta called Housing ATL. Sarah was called on, ULI was called on to really lead that effort. And we've been working all year on that. She'll speak some about that, not necessarily that that's a plan for Decatur, but we can learn and get some of those ideas. Also, just as a little aside, you'll notice that we've had three dynamic women presenting here. They are running the world. Just want to remind you. But we're going to bring Eric up in a moment. Eric, a guy, still working. Eric Kronberg is the principal and co-founder of Atlanta-based firm Kronberg Wall Architects with his partner, Adam Wall. He leads the firm's pre-development efforts by combining skills in planning, development, architecture, and zoning. I understand he's got a strong prayer life, too, in this work. So his work, he's worked with Congress for New Urbanism, Georgia Conservancy, Atlanta Bicycle Coalition, all the groups that really make great communities. So I've introduced both of them. I'm going to ask Sarah to come up first, then Eric. If you'll hold your questions until they get through with their presentation, then we'll come back and have a good discussion. They'll be available for that. Sarah? Thank you.
Thank you. All right. So it's officially good afternoon. It is a pleasure to be with all of you. As Bill said, I'm Sarah Kirsch. I run ULI Atlanta, which is a little bit of a misnomer. It's technically Georgia, Alabama, and Eastern Tennessee. You can imagine Alabama and Eastern Tennessee aren't too happy about that. But we are a mission-driven and member-driven nonprofit. Bill shared with you our mission about responsible land use, building and sustaining thriving communities, and we are supported by our members. We've got about 1,200 members here in the Atlanta region and about 40,000 members worldwide. And I describe our members as everyone who touches how cities get built. So if you're an architect, a planner, a developer, a nonprofit leader, a lender, this is the place where all of those people come together to learn, to develop professionally, and my favorite part is problem solve. So our work within ULI cuts across these 5 pillars: housing and communities, finance and investment, sustainability and economic performance, shaping successful cities and regions, and the practice of real estate development. You never get it perfect, you're always practicing. And really, so much of what we do is addressing all of those disciplines within particular issues. Housing, and specifically housing affordability, was in our constitutional documents when we were formed in 1936. And it's been something that we have focused on throughout the life of ULI. But I'll admit it's something that's sort of waxed and waned. It's been top of mind at times. It's top of mind when the Terwilliger Center was formed, which has really driven the research that we do on this. Coming out of the financial and housing crisis, not as top of mind, right? People were more worried about how we get home values back up. But certainly over the last 5 years, it has been incredibly top of mind here in Atlanta and across the country. So because we do all this work, I'm here to tell you there is a silver bullet. We found it. You just have this one thing you have to do and you'll solve your affordability challenges. This is my attempt at humor. There is no silver bullet. we get together, as Bill was mentioning, with our colleagues from across the country, particularly do this twice a year. And we love to spend the first day of those meetings with our fellow executive directors just talking about what are the issues, what are your members caring about, what are your cities caring about, and what are you doing uniquely to address it. And I would say for the last 5 years, housing affordability has been the #1 issue out of every district council across the country. And what we say at every single one of those meetings is there is no silver bullet. It's a lot of 2% solutions, which is sort of exhausting when you hear it, right? A lot of 2% solutions. Those are meant to be the 2% solutions. And you know, there is always going to be context for what solutions work in different areas. Doesn't mean that you have to have 50 that you're working on at all times at a regional level. We certainly need 50 that we're working on at all times. But when you're thinking about how you uniquely address the affordability challenges here in Decatur, they're going to need to be at least 10, 20, you know, that someone's waking up every day and thinking about executing on. I specifically brought up this silver bullet, analogy because I would say that our work in housing affordability at ULI Atlanta really took on a deeper level because of this silver bullet mentality. I noticed even within my members who are people who deal with these issues all the time, and if they don't deal with them in their day jobs, they understand them, they understand the finance issues, they understand all those acronyms that get thrown at you. And even they were suffering from this if we would only mentality. It was if we would only permit accessory dwelling units, we wouldn't have an affordability problem. If we would only broaden inclusionary zoning, we wouldn't have an affordability problem. And there are lots of tools in the toolbox, but we need a lot of them. And that is what we've learned through our work here, and it's what we've learned across the country. So we set out a few years ago with the help of Bleakley Advisory Group, and I know there's one team member here from Bleakley, to say, okay, we know there's no silver bullet. We know it's complicated. How can we better understand the issue? How can we define the problems? Because just like the silver bullet issue, you also had the I know what the problem is issue, right? Everyone had sort of their understanding of what the problem was, and that's because housing's personal. I say it's like education, right? We've all been to school, so we're all experts on education, right? We've all lived in homes, so we're all experts on homes. I'm saying that a little flippantly, but it's personal to our family members, it's personal to our neighbors, and so we see it through a particular lens. And if you're in the business, you see it through that particular business lens. So we said, all right, let's step back, let's define the problems, let's define the dimensions of the need, because, you know, how big of a problem is this? And then let's start to map which solutions address which problems, right? Which do you need the hammer for? Which do you need the wrench for? I could continue this tools analogy a little further, but, how do we best think about which ones will solve which problems? So we came up with this whole list of questions through a group called our Livable Communities Council and working with Bleakley Advisory Group, and we said, let's set out and try, and based on the data, based on the trends, based on what we can learn from other places in the country, how do we answer these questions? I'm not going to walk you through all this work, but I do want to share a few things with you. One was, what are the dimensions of the affordability need at a regional level? And I know we're not here to talk about the region, but I think it's important to think about that, Decatur operates in a much larger housing market here in the county, here in the region, and that we'll have different solutions in different areas. So 2.1 million households in our region. About 1.4 of those are here in what we called our 5 core counties. So what makes them core, Sarah? 80% of our regional jobs are in these core counties: Fulton, DeKalb, Gwinnett, Clayton. Who did I just leave off? Gwinnett. Cobb. All right. Thank you. Y'all are paying attention. Excellent. So 80% of our jobs are in those 5 core counties. And why does that matter? Is because part of Atlanta's affordability issue is not just the cost of housing. We were talking about this at our table up front. It's the cost of transportation. So that is fairly uniquely Atlanta. We're the fastest sprawling region in the world, maybe next to Las Vegas. And we grew on the backs of what people like to call drive till you qualify, right? Just keep going out until you can afford the mortgage or you can afford the rent. Well, what that meant is that people were spending as much, if not more, of their monthly income on transportation as they were on their housing. So when we think about housing solutions in Atlanta, we have to think about that transportation component, and one major proxy for that is jobs, right? Where are the jobs so people have access to jobs, and then you typically have more amenities and more services where the jobs are. Good healthcare, good schools, so forth. So we focused on those 5 core counties. Within those 5 core counties, about 650,000 are earning less than 80% of area median income. And I don't know, Ann, if you spend a lot of time talking about terms and definitions, but we picked 80% for our work, which we can debate. But above 80% in the region, you can get market solutions. You can get regular developers, you can get some creative solutions, and this is at a regional scale, not necessarily here in the city and not necessarily in the city of Atlanta, but you can address those needs through different solutions. Below 80 in the 5 core county, not a lot of market solutions. You're going to need creative financing, you're going to need some type of subsidy, typically. You know, these are all rules of thumb. You can point out an exception and I'll grade you that, but that's why we picked 80. And then I believe you've talked about this already today. So of those 650, 340,000 are what we call cost burden, so spending more than a third, roughly, of their income on housing, meaning they don't have enough left over for, healthcare, they don't have enough left over for hopefully a little savings and so forth. So that was the order of magnitude that we said, okay, we can all agree that we understand how big of a problem this is. We're talking 340,000 households. I'm just going to share a couple other in the weeds things here. Another thing that we wanted to talk about was, what's going on in the rental market. You all see the headlines, I'm sure, of all that we're building is luxury, and that is an issue for sure. What doesn't get as much attention is what's happening with the existing housing stock. So this top line was newly constructed apartments that were renting for about $1,600 a month, not affordable if you remember from earlier conversations. But the bigger story is what's happened with existing product that was built before 2012. Those light green lines used to rent for $800, $850. That was affordable to those folks earning less than 80% of AMI. They've now gone up to almost $1,100, no longer affordable, right? So that's the pain, I think, that we're all feeling. It's the stories you hear of people saying, I've been priced out of my apartment for the second time in a year, 2 years. I'm being forced to move, etc. So yes, the concentration of the new market at the high end is an issue, but the bigger issue is what's happening with the existing stock. Another big issue that I don't know always gets a lot of headlines is we're just not building as much housing as we used to. If you drag this chart back into the 80s, you'd see that the Atlanta region on average was building 60 to 65,000 homes a year, year over year. Take out those crazy 2004 years where everything just looked like it was under construction all the time. But year after year after year, we were building 60 to 65,000 homes a year. Since the recovery, we're only building about 30 to 35,000 homes a year. We're building half as much as we used to while still adding more jobs than we ever did. So, if you took economics in high school, or if you're one of those who excelled and, took it in college and so forth, you build less of it and you got the just fundamental supply and demand, prices are going up. So we have that production issue as well. So our work landed on 8 core issues for our region when we think about housing affordability. Almost half of jobs pay salaries that can't afford our new housing options. What's being built now, half of folks can't afford it. There's a lack of affordable production and production in general compared with the past. We talked about this already. We have among the highest combined cost of housing and transportation. Obviously, high transportation costs result from long commutes, which also increase congestion. Our affordable inventory is isolated from job centers and transit, which exacerbates number 3. Number 6, much of the existing affordable inventory is reaching the end of its useful life. So the IRS devalues apartments to 0, I think around year 23, right? So it's at that point that people go, okay, we're gonna reinvest, or it's gonna continue to decline, or we're gonna, you get to the point at some point where people say we're gonna tear it down. So we're reaching a lot of the end of the useful life of some of that stock. Demand for in-town locations, like here in Decatur, is substantial and growing just based on changes in fundamental demographics, and that's driving up prices. And then finally, it's impacting our economic competitiveness on a national scale. We used to be able to tout that we were really affordable. If you talk to folks at the Metro Chamber, they'll say, you know, we sort of pulled that off as one of our key talking points. And if a major company's coming to town, one of their first questions is going to be is, what's your housing strategy? You know, do you have a plan? Because they don't want to be associated with displacement and driving prices up. So we came up with this vision. We talked about the need, that we've got 340,000 need now. It's growing by 5,000 a year over the next 10 years. So we said, all right, big, hairy, audacious goal. What if we could create and preserve 10,000 units a year in those 5 core counties for a total of 100,000? How could we get there? And we put together sort of a plan of what that might look like. It's going to need everyone rowing in the same direction. It's going to need a strategy at every community and city level. So really grateful y'all are here doing this work, because 10,000 is a big number and a big goal. Does not seem to be advancing. It's going to take all hands on deck. The public sector, nonprofit, and private sector. This isn't one person's issue. It really requires everyone at the table. And we identified 5 pillars for how we would go about getting there. That we need to increase production, both at the mid-market and affordable. We talked about how production was down. We need to maintain the existing affordability, so we got to preserve what we have, stop the bleeding of that loss. Lessen housing and transportation costs, so thinking about where we're locating and how we're investing in transit and making sure we're having those conversations at the same time. Number 4 is a really big deal, expanding capital resources. We know we can't keep relying on all of the same funding streams. We're going to need new funding streams, both public, nonprofit, philanthropic, and private sector resources that can be brought to the table. And then number 5, provide regional leadership. You know, we're going to need some coordination on this, and how do we make sure that we're, you know, all moving in the same direction. And this is the really exciting news. Had you told me when we started this work 2 years ago or so that the Atlanta Regional Commission would look at this and go, this is a great framework, we have some tweaks, but we think we want to execute on this, and that's exactly what they've done. Through Catalyst, which I think Bill mentioned this morning, which is the ARC's regional competitiveness strategy, they are really picking this up and putting the horsepower of ARC behind it to say, okay, let's work on this regional housing strategy. And they are doing number 5 with the help of a lot of other people in this room. So that's a really big deal, and the first time I remember that in our region. And then we have those 5 things, right? The increased production, maintain what we've got, think about transportation, we need more money, and then we need leadership. And we said, okay, for renters and for rental product and for owner product, what could some of those solutions look like? This is not an exhaustive list. This is just meant to illustrate what we could do. I'll highlight a few. So those are the strategies, and then under green are the tactics, specifically what they might be. We could lessen development costs through cost-conscious design solutions. I think we'll hear some more about that after my talk by someone who is truly the regional expert on that. We need to maintain affordable inventory. This is one of my favorites. Offer 10-year tax abatement on rehabbed affordable units which maintain affordability. So yes, there's a cost to the municipality by saying we'll give you that tax abatement, but it's a lot less expensive than trying to recreate those units, right? So that's a tool that you have that you can use if you don't already. I'm not an expert on Decatur's housing policy. Lessen housing and transportation costs, obviously locating units near affordable housing, near employment centers, continuing to work with MARTA and ATL as they expand. Expanding capital resources. This is one of my favorites. I don't know if anyone from ARC is here, but you know, ARC's done this great Livable Centers initiative. We can turn all of those areas into what are called TADs, tax allocation districts, and use that tax increment to fund housing. And then leadership. We've talked about that, and that's where we've seen just phenomenal progress in the last 12 to 18 months, both at the local and regional scale. And there are a lot of other examples. And then you need different strategies for owners, right? Again, regulatory reform, opportunities with the homestead exemption, regional down payment assistance programs, and thinking about regional new fundings, and then again leadership. And I'm happy to provide all of these if you want to dig in. And again, these are meant to be illustrative, but that you have to think differently about rental solutions versus owner. And then you have to make sure they're really sensitive to your specific environment. So that was the big regional, right? Here's a framework. Here's how we can be thinking about this at the regional scale, and then how we're gonna need to dig in differently. I wanna share a little bit about what Bill mentioned, which was House ATL. This was an initiative that formed about a year ago in sort of the kernels of our imagination through the Blank Family Foundation, Metro Atlanta Chamber, Central Atlanta Progress, a group called Center for Civic Innovation, and ULI, and said we've got a real moment in time. We know that home prices in the city of Atlanta are escalating like nothing we have ever seen. We can look at our peers across the country and know where this is headed, right? We spent some time out in San Diego, another group spent some time in Seattle, and we go, man, we're about 10 years behind them, but I don't think it's gonna take us 10 years to get there, right? At the rate we're going, you know, we maybe have 5 years before we're in the situation of some of these really high cost markets. And then we also had a political moment with the mayoral election, and Mayor Bottoms at one point making that $1 billion challenge for investment in affordable housing, and we saw it as an opportunity to get all of us out of our silos. You know, ULI was off doing this regional strategy, and other groups were doing all their great work, but not many of us were in the same room doing it together. And we said, here's an opportunity to get us all under the same tent and think about what we can agree on. I think it was one of our friends at Georgia Act said, you know, there's probably 70% of things that public sector, private sector, nonprofit, philanthropic agree on. Let's focus on that. So I don't want to tell you exactly what all we came up with because it may or may not be relevant, but I do want to talk to you a little bit about the process that we went through. As I mentioned, it's a cross-sector group of leaders, kind of, again, everyone who's involved in these housing issues. We worked over 10 months with over 200 participants. We have an executive committee that developed 8 guiding principles that we said we're gonna vet all of this through, and I think that's really important. You have to articulate what your values are and what you're really trying to accomplish, and make sure that you're transparent about that. In the end, we came up with 23 data-driven recommendations that we are beginning the process of chipping away at. What may have been unique about this, and I shared this with Angela and others, is through some of the participants, we used this tool that said, how do we define the problem? And you know, how you define your problem ultimately determines where you're headed. And it was this, there's an Einstein quote that I'll botch a little bit, that you should spend 95% of your time defining the problem and 5% coming up with the solution. And we took that advice very much to heart. And we spent an enormous amount of time defining the problem. Probably to those of us with a little sense of urgency, drove us a little crazy. You know, didn't we do this? Can't we move on? But it really helped us unpack where we had disconnects in, again, which tool we wanted to use to solve which problem, right? That we weren't trying to have this blanket approach. So this is for House ATL, how we defined our problem. That civic leadership in the city of Atlanta, and by civic we meant not just public sector, we meant everyone, right? Public, private, nonprofit, lacks a shared comprehensive set of policies and adequate funding to address housing affordability. And then we spent a lot of time saying why. Why do we have this problem? What are the barriers? One, because it's a complicated subject matter. I think most of the time, I think this is a very sophisticated audience. Most of the time you start talking housing, you get, one page in and people go, oh my gosh, this is, really difficult and I don't know what I can do about it. So it's complicated. There's a lack of community consensus and political will. We lack flexible, robust local funding. And as I mentioned previously, efforts to address are not coordinated. We're all off doing our own thing, thinking that we were gonna to make the difference. And as a result, we're among the worst cities in the US for economic mobility and income disparity. Low-income Atlantans' lives are harder, both in terms of health, education, housing stability, and access. We're losing the social mosaic of our city. We treasure that diversity and we're losing it. I mentioned the risk of losing our affordable economic competitive advantage. We have flat or declining amount of affordable housing stock, and residents are being displaced. We spent so much time getting to this. Is that a barrier or is it an outcome? It sounds very academic, but it was so important to how we then set forth on our work, which was under these 5 working groups. And there are a couple things I want to share about this, how we structured this. Community retention is up here first for a reason. It's where the most anxiety was and the most immediate need. People feeling pricing pressures to being forced out of their neighborhoods right then there. And so that was a major focus. Existing housing affordable preservation. Low-hanging fruit, if there is any, it's still difficult, but we need to preserve what we've got, right? And so let's focus on that. We called out specifically under 50% of area median income. When you study the data, it's where the vast majority of the need is in the city, but it's not where we have a lot of solutions. As I mentioned before, there are not a lot of private market solutions for under 50. It's about philanthropic and city tools, and we really needed to dig on what solutions were available there. Public resources for production and new private investment, and I think those are self-explanatory. But one thing, if you were to set off, and I think this is sort of what you're doing on a process like this, what was so important about this process is we didn't have everyone sort of go to their corners, right? So in the public resources for production, it wasn't just the public sector leaders. It was lots of different perspectives on how you can leverage public resources. In the new private investment, it wasn't just the developers and the bankers, right? You had nonprofit developers, you had housing advocates, you had sort of a real diversity of thought and perspectives talking about each of these issues, even if it wasn't theirs to own. And so I think that's a critical lesson for me out of this work, is you're going to come up with different answers depending on who you have in the room. And it's really important to not do that, okay, you run off, come up with your things, and then report back based on your typical ways of getting together. You need to sort of break down those silos even within your group. I have a few more things I wanted to share. I shared that we have these guiding principles. I'd highlight, that for us it was really important to talk about housing as a means to an end. Housing is a product, but really housing is about achieving all those other things that we care about with educational outcomes, with income mobility, with issues of equity. And so it was important to lead with that. And there are all the others. We made sure that we consulted lots of experts. Anne came and talked to us at the very beginning. We relied on DCA and their expertise. We relied on Dan Emmerbach, lots of folks who and then we brought in national experts as well. So, making sure you use all the resources there. And then we came up with these 4 buckets of recommendations. And out of those 23, kind of distilled them down to tell this story. We're going to invest in Affordable Atlanta with $500 million in public resources and $500 million in private resources over the next 8 to 10 years to produce and preserve 20,000 units. So that gets us to 2,000, 2,500 a year of those 10,000 that I was talking about before. Prioritizing community investment without displacement. So a comprehensive anti-displacement strategy. So when you have major infrastructure coming in, when you have major new developments, that folks who've been there are able to benefit. Working together better and smarter. Addressing the fact that we're working in silos, having what we're calling a funders collective. I'll highlight this one because I think it's starting in the city, but it's really meant to have regional application. And if you're trying to put together an affordable housing project, you're meeting with 15, 20, 25 different people, and trying to get that funding. And this is an effort to bring everyone together. So that you are able to sort of have that one-stop shop of getting your project financed, which is a big deal. We recommended a cabinet level position within the city, and that's now been named with Terry Lee serving as the Chief Housing Officer for the city, so that was a big deal. But this coordination is so critical starting now, right? We have to work on the policies, we have to identify the new funding, but you've got to get that coordination right from the beginning. And then empowering Atlantans' education and engagement. Trying to address that it's complicated, and it's, a lot of people don't make that connection that it's not just about housing, it's about those other goals. If you care about healthcare, you gotta care about housing. If you care about educational attainment, you care about housing, right? So trying to help people connect those dots. And frankly, also helping this address issues, which is maybe housing's biggest challenge, which is the quintessential, not in my backyard, the NIMBYism, right? So if folks can have a deeper understanding of what it's about, you can help address those. So I'm not going to go, these are each of those broken out. I'm pretty sure I'm at time or over time, looking at Bill. But, you know, these are each of these, and you all can spend some time with it. But, you know, I'll highlight a few other things. We chose to focus everything from 0 to 120% of area median income with our work, which you may go, oh, that's a wide range. And that was very much by design. It was the first time we'd had the conversation with housing folks and homelessness advocates, as those are conversations that have been really happening in 2 different places, and increasingly, you know, we see it very much related, particularly as we're losing this affordable stock, and now homelessness is also an issue related to housing, and we could go on for that for a while. We've talked about all of these. Going. And we do have, House ATL has a website, it's houseatl.org, no www, just houseatl.org. So if you, all those 23 recommendations are there, it's where we're going to use to continue to update. So if you're particularly interested in this work, this is a great resource. Another great resource for folks that I shared is one called localhousingsolutions.org. So if you are interested in this and you just want to learn more personally, those are 2 that I would recommend to you for additional resources. And with that, we'll hold any questions until the end, and I'll turn it over to Eric.
Hello, everybody. Eric Kronberg. Introduction while they set up. Like I said earlier, I'm actually more of the chief troublemaker in our office. It's my job to come in and break zoning codes and find creative ways to make things happen and ruffle a lot of feathers, and hopefully have some good things happen at the end. So, and I kind of like to ruffle feathers, so I want to challenge some of your assumptions today and try to reframe some key issues to talk about housing. Can you Control L? That should take it to full screen. Or you can go to view in full screen there. Yeah, there we go. Cool. All right. So my firm, we do development, we do architecture, we do planning, we do zoning. We tackle things from a broad range of possibilities. Our job is to take blighted, disadvantaged places and make them better. And backing up. One of the things we really care about from both commercial and residential development is that we really believe that existing walkable areas with infrastructure in place are the easiest targets to retrofit to solve for sprawl, but also to solve for housing shortages, for lack of affordability, for lack of diverse neighborhoods, and lack of resiliency. And if you don't know what I mean by infrastructure, literally that's on-street parking, that's sidewalks, that's street trees, that's original block structures close to goods, services, and transit. That might look a lot like a lot of Decatur. And there's also a lot of barriers to why we don't have more of the housing that we're looking for and that we need. And today we're going to talk about some of those. Briefly, we've got a ton of outdated codes and ordinances. I'm going to talk about those from a zoning perspective, where they've came from and why. The zoning ordinances tend to require each development to cover public goods. I'm going to explain what that means in a second as well. And then there's also, in the public, a long-standing perception of scarcity. And typically, for the scarcity we're talking about, is road capacity through traffic, and then in Decatur, absolutely schools, because oh my God, if another kid comes to the city and moves in, our schools are just going to go to hell. So let's get past it. But let's start with the zoning and our outdated codes and ordinances and where they come from. And we need to be honest about this, and one of the things that we tackle and talk about a lot is that single-family only zoning is really, really, really bad. And here's why. It's exceedingly exclusionary, and it comes from a racist and classist background, and we need to accept and understand that. And if you want to read up on it, Color Law is an amazing book that goes through the last 100 years of zoning and finance and how racism has been perpetuated through the federal government on down. And these legacies stick with us today. And a couple ways these show up are in large minimum lot sizes, which drive up housing prices, and then also creating scarcities. And these outcomes require cars to get around because you can't walk, which is another form of exclusion because cars are really expensive. We never understand how expensive cars really are. Now, when we talk about public goods being required in each lot, what I mean by that is typical zoning says we should have all the parking your use is ever going to need on your site. You should take care of all the stormwater you should ever need on your site. You should take care of all the green space for your contribution to society on your site. So all those things get you this diagram on top. That's called suburbia, right? That's how this works. In a traditional development pattern, in a traditional city, you might have a common green. You might have all the buildings up at the street. You might have some common parking in the back and some on-street in the front. And no individual lot is fulfilling its zoning requirements because this whole situation or neighborhood works together. So understanding what suburbia requires and the zoning matters because you can't get this with suburban zoning. The other thing that's really helpful to frame the conversation is that neighborhoods are ecosystems. When they work well, every different component of ecosystem works together in symbiosis to make a better place. This is 7th Ward of Treme in New Orleans. We've done a lot of infill affordable housing there. We did a map, just out of curiosity, of all the different components in this neighborhood, which is basically, I don't want to call it a single family neighborhood because New Orleans was built before zoning, but this is just a functioning ecosystem, primarily residential with tons of stuff interwoven, and it is an amazing place. And it's also helpful to understand that where we live, our habitats, we tend to think of not like that. We need to reframe the question. These are really complex systems. We know so much more about natural habitats, understand their complexities, how they work together, and we really dumb down how we think our habitats work as humans. And the way our suburban rules play out, this is the exact same scale. I'm pretty sure this is up in Cumberland or Cobb Parkway somewhere, but this is 1,000 square feet of suburban zoning rules. And this is what happens when you develop before zoning in much smaller increments and much more walkable and human scale. So here's the deal though. Why am I talking about suburban zoning on a housing thing? Before World War II, this is basically how we developed cities. You know, buildings all up on a street, close together and walkable. Well, after World War II, FHA funded loans for veterans, but those loans only qualified in the suburbs. So everybody had to move to the suburbs if you want a government-backed loan that sent you out to here. Now, the problem is, in the 60s and 70s, the Decatur experienced this. All these in-town cities are like, oh my gosh, we're getting our butts kicked. We need some economic development. We need some of that magic juice that the suburbs have. Let's adopt their zoning, right? So we take their zoning, apply it, and so what do you do when you have to have a parking lot in every site? You tear down about 2/3 of your buildings, and this is what you're left with, which is a slightly different version of that with 1 or 2 buildings left that are worth a damn, and the rest of us is crap. So, how are we going to get past that? We need to talk about alternatives and kinds of things that would be acceptable in a walkable, engaged community. And the Drexel Street over there is awesome. Angela and the Decatur team have done such a great job with great graphics and visuals to help with this. But when we talk about things that are equal in mass and scale to single family, so often called missing middle housing, that's some of the stuff we're going to talk about for a few minutes. But not only that, where we put this stuff is also tremendously important. We talk a lot about that there's different values to land, not just economic, but I'd say social and moral values. Land that is close to transit, to heavy rail transit stations like MARTA, have a much higher moral obligation to provide housing because those are places we have a chance to use housing with less cars. So, but it's not only that, we also have a huge shortage of housing within these places, which again, the Drexel slide just over there shows a lot of, because we've made it illegal to provide any kind of housing other than single family. And you cannot have the things we want, walkable, diverse, affordable, resilient, in single family only neighborhoods. It just doesn't work. So let's talk about some of the stuff that could fit in. You know, when we talk about trying to encourage small development, I had a great quote the other day that we have tons of small development going on. It's just really big, oversized single family homes, right? We're really good at doing that because that's all our zoning allows and that's all our finance knows how to do. So we are great at small development as humans. It's just all the wrong stuff because the rules we're forced to follow. So let's talk about some things when modifying the rules to have some better stuff. Again, larger single family home, sixplex, the exact same size. This is a duplex with an ADU behind, which is also a triplex. So there are different ways to provide housing choice at smaller size that are compatible with other places in this fashion. This is an example we've been using in different forms and fashions. You know, the typical smaller existing single-family house. You know, this in Atlanta is to scale the maxed out zoning you could build in R4, our typical single-family zoning. In R5, we've changed our duplex zoning laws to now allow 2 attached houses and 2 attached ADUs in the back. So we've got a hack now to get to a 4-plex in single-family zoning. This is really critical to do. Other things we want people to think about in Decatur are that the notion of 1 ADU is really not enough. allowing an attached unit to have a single-family house, an attached ADU, and a detached ADU is a really important thing to think about to get your housing choice up in appropriate places, which is anywhere walkable, which is most of Decatur. And so this is what you've got in Decatur, right? A little bit bigger lots, often sometimes 200 feet deep, typically 50 feet wide. You don't have a lot of housing density here, and you wonder why your housing is so expensive, because this is all you're building, because it's all you're allowed to build. This is an example of what you can do to start chipping away, particularly at corner lots. One of the big plugs I want to put for ADUs, they are really different.
What's an ADU?
Thank you, sir. It's an accessory dwelling unit. It's a little guest cottage, granny flat, carriage house, you know, all these different names. The small little house that goes in the backyard, they're really difficult to finance. You basically got to pay cash to do one. So if you want to change the rules on that, this is a land use, this is a subdivision ordinance thing. If you would allow on a corner lot in particular, this back piece of this lot to be subdivided as its own lot, then you're just financing a house. Banks know how to finance houses all day long. They have no idea how to finance an ADU. Appraisers have no idea either, which is why the banks don't know how to do it. And then Angela asked us to talk about a cottage court. You know, what we would love in terms of incentivizing cottage courts is if you keep the existing houses in the front, usually smaller scale ones, and are allowed to put 3 or 4 or 8 cottages in the back on a 2-lot solution, you've got a cute as hell, great little housing option right there. Anytime you have zoning that allows a townhome development of any kind and a cottage court's allowed, you will never get a cottage court. The math never works. Townhomes produce twice as much income for the builder. It's not going to happen. There's nothing wrong with townhomes, but if we're going to try to infill our single-family neighborhoods, a townhome development may not be the most appropriate, where a cottage court would fit in much nicer. All right, so some of the strategies I'd like to talk about. We're going to skip over accessory dwelling units today because you guys got this from a zoning perspective. And subsidized affordable housing I'm going to skip because there's not enough money to do that, and I don't have that much time. So I'm going to hit the 2 in the middle, a little bit of missing middle, a little bit of pocket neighborhoods, which is a kind of a deviation of missing middle housing. So hopefully most people in the room have heard about missing middle housing. It's everything more than a single family house and generally less than that 100-unit apartment complex. We're going to be talking about some of the smaller scale stuff and give you some examples and hopefully plant some seeds. We did a study for Brunswick, Georgia earlier this year and looked at some ways of how housing could work. They have 30-foot wide lots. This can translate to wider lots, but at the smaller scale, this is what we're talking about. They've got some great shotgun cottages that are just wonderful in their old town neighborhood. We're looking at ways of how can you do new and expand on that. And so the example is, you know, shotgun, cottage. You can park all this with 6 parking places in the back for 4 units and have it look wonderful at the street. Like, this is not complicated stuff. The next step up is you get to a duplex, you know, downstairs unit, upstairs unit. This is all residential code. This is relatively straightforward to build and design. 2 of these side by side. You pop a cottage in the back. You've got a wonderful 5-unit little development. 5 garages off the alley if you want to really bling it out and do that. Like, these are the ways to do it. You've got on-street parking in the front. Super heavy park for what you're doing. This is nice stuff. You can go really fancy with the manor house, right? They have some great, beautiful old houses that are massively underutilized because they're just too big for anybody to afford in Brunswick. This is taking those into 6 units or on each side, or 4-plex on this one, 4-plex there, a couple ADUs in the back. This is what you get for a wonderful little housing development in very limited land, right? Our zoning doesn't allow this. Lot coverage is an example of trying to limit public good. If you're near transit, you should be able to cover more lot. You should do less stormwater. You should have more walkability, less parking. This is how this stuff ties together. This is a lot we were asked to analyze in Decatur, and this is an example of how cottages can be a really powerful tool for historic preservation. You know, this is one of your older houses in the neighborhood in the 1860s. Tons of trees to save. You can do a really wonderful cottage development, turn this into co-housing, and have a great opportunity in a single-family neighborhood. If this is allowed to go townhomes, it's going to get scraped, and you'd have triple the density. And density is not bad, but if you're going to look at historic preservation goals and tree preservation goals, cottages are a powerful tool to consider. All right, key things. Alleys are really important to park these things well. You've got to understand what places with alleys have extra advantages to pull these off. Most of these maintain historic lot sizes, which get you great granular infill, which benefit your neighborhoods. That's really helpful and important. And I've talked about townhomes versus cottage courts 3 times. Don't forget, townhomes are fine, but not necessarily in single family. Cottages should be fine in single family anywhere in the city. Pocket neighborhoods are a little bit bigger, more intensive way to do this stuff. This is an example project I'm building and developing as we speak. It's over in Edgewood by the MARTA station. So this is 2 and a half acre lot. I live here. We're building a bunch of houses, but it's not just that we're building a bunch of houses. Every one of these pink houses has a live work studio. That's a 250 square foot studio. It has a sink, it has a toilet, it has a shower. Everybody here is allowed to rent those out for Airbnb, use them for home office, use them for long-term housing, use them however they want to generate revenue to reduce their housing costs while they're here. These guys all in the blue are duplexes, so they're smaller units. That is a 1 bed, 1.5 bath house for sale. That's how you get housing affordability. You build small and sell fee simple. These in the back are all going to be held for rental. There's going to be some basement apartments at like 400 square feet. I'm going to rent them for $2 a foot, and they're still going to hit 80% of AMI without any subsidy. Going next, this is what it looks like. It can look nice and serve a need too, right? These are those little guest live work suites right there. There's another one right there. They're clearing about $2,000 a month in Airbnb with that one right there, dramatically reducing their cost of housing. And we ran some numbers, when I say we ran some numbers, I did a really ugly spreadsheet, and I handed it to Elizabeth in our office, who does all these presentations, and went away for an hour and came back with this amazing chart. This is what it looks like with a $570,000 house, typical mortgage, typical down payment. These are your costs. You should be making about $150,000 a year to afford this as a 2-income family or a single-income family. That's what it takes. If you take the house in La France and you go from 2 car to 1 car, it really drops your housing. And then if you also throw in the ADU, or the live work studio, it takes your housing down even more. You end up being at about 46% of savings for housing cost if you have rental income by being a landlord of some fashion and going to 1 car. Car cost matters, supplemental income through housing choice matters, and we have one is a long-term housing unit that's being provided to a nurse. I mean, this is how you get housing choice and affordability without subsidy. Again, this is the pretty slide I missed, but again, you go from one house to little house and little house, and then you get rid of one of those cars. Things really get better on private sector side. I had to rezone this property 3 times to figure this out, okay? I'm a glutton for punishment. I kept coming back. I'm like, I'm going to get it right. If you kill me, we'll get there. But this is what it took. Challenge with pocket neighborhoods, a lot of rezoning and variances. They're complicated. Case-by-case basis for zoning, typically not a good way to do these things on a policy standpoint other than example projects maybe. And they require larger plots of land. That's not necessarily bad if you've got some weird funky sites hanging out on the edges of your neighborhood. This is a way to make better use of those land from a housing choice. But not necessarily to fill in an individual lot. That's where you really want to get your zoning fixed for cottage courts and other manners. Big things to take away. Really, we feel that the most important thing to do is to focus on land in accessible places. That means you're a quarter to a half mile from a MARTA station. I don't care if you're zoned single family. It's on you to provide better housing there. That's a policy thing all of us in this room have to advocate for. Angela and the city needs our help. They can't do that alone. They need citizens to demand this. ADUs, cottages, duplexes, in single-family zoning without special permission, critical component to get this stuff right. Lot subdivision standards for cottage courts and for fee simple ADUs. That's a critical tool if you actually want to do this with existing financing structure. That matters a lot. Parking requirements are a huge issue in all of this too. If you're close to transit, drop your parking requirements. Let on-street parking places count. Atlanta, we're looking at a new infill housing zoning category that requires half a parking space per unit. And on-street spaces count. That's a totally reasonable parking metric if you're close to transit. That's not freaky. That's normal. Understand that it's normal. And that's what I got. Thank you.
All right, the great disruptor, Eric. The great regional leader, Sarah. Why don't you ask any questions, clarification? Who wants one of these projects in their yard? Eric is. Hold on. All right, so we're gonna cover some questions. We're a little behind today, so we're not going to spend an hour on this, but I want to get around. Okay.
Hi. Is an ADU the same as a tiny house?
Yes and no. But it can be. Doesn't have to be. Tiny houses usually are less than 400 square feet. Like if you want to define it somehow, sometimes on wheels, sometimes on foundations. An ADU is always on a foundation. It's built to building codes. It's basically a small house, but zoning determines how big they can be. In Atlanta, we changed the zoning to say they could be up to 750 square feet. Decatur, it's 800 square feet for 1 story, I think, and 1,000 for 2 story.
800 across.
800 across, thank you. And I'll tell you what, full disclosure, we have a design build company that does ADUs for homeowners full service. A 750 square foot ADU is a house. It is big. It's a 2-bedroom, 2-bath house. Just for perspective, and I mean that in a great way, it is a lot of space for a single parent and kids to live, an aging couple to live. It's not the tiny houses you see at the Tiny House Fest. They're our friends, we love them, but it's not the same thing. You got a lot more room for storage.
Yes, sir. I was wondering if your company, Kronberg Wall, employs the green standards such as LEED.
We care a lot about housing sustainability, and we use smart design and energy practices in everything we do. I think LEED's a racket, frankly. That's my opinion. But I think building sustainably matters tremendously. And so we do that significantly. But the other thing I'll point out is the most sustainable building we believe wholeheartedly is the building that's already been built. That's why most of our practice is adaptive reuse and saving old buildings. It's a lot easier and better to save one than to build a new one.
Yes, sir. I want you to talk a little more about stormwater. We have a long, skinny lot, and we had trouble getting a small tool shed put up behind our house because it gave us too much impenetrable surface, and we didn't have enough open land for runoff. Talk about stormwater.
You got about an hour? Yeah. So I think that I have a lot of strong opinions about stormwater, and usually with F-bombs and other kinds of things that associate with it. I think that we need to rethink our stormwater policy significantly in the state of Georgia, and I think that where context matters tremendously, and that expecting every site to do its own stormwater is ludicrous. Now, I'm all for watershed-based and stormwater management, but we've got to rethink the individual burden on homeowners. That being said, there's a lot. I mean, there's just a cost of pervious pavers, ripping up some cover and changing some things around. And so you can fight the system, or you can spend some money on pavers to get the shed in. And sometimes you got to do what you got to do.
Hi, I was interested in the cost of these smaller homes because I heard it costs more to make a 1.5-story than a 2-story. So how can you?
Yeah. So ATLADUCO.com. That's our business. That's our sister company. When I say we're doing design build ADUs, we've got a standard 1-bedroom model and a standard 2-bedroom model, pre-designed, basic finish, and primo finish. And the pricing's fixed. It includes permitting, deployment, everything. A 1-bedroom premium is $112,000. That's 450 square feet. The 2-bedroom premium, if my brain's working with tariffs built in, is about $159,000. That's 750 square feet. So you can run the numbers back. That's permitting, design, hard costs, vertical, horizontal, tie-in, everything. We're doing that across Atlanta. ATL, ADU. Yeah, thank you. So the question is, how much do tiny houses cost, right?
Well, cottages.
Yeah, cottages, right? They're expensive because it's the cost of kitchen and baths that really drive it up. But our sister company is providing full service accessory dwelling units. Website is ATLADUCO.com. We're also on Facebook if you choose to rack your brain in social media space. But the website, we have a full layout.
We're going to have all this for them later.
Yeah,
Okay, my question is for Sarah.
Yes, she needs
Sarah,
one.
you have, at this time that you were talking about earlier, that the group is, that your partner groups have played a part in identifying the problem. I did not hear any part of that pie where income is increased. The state of Georgia and the 5 regional areas have a low income base, and the diversity of the disparity, I should say, between the income is the big problem with the affordability of the housing. How do you plan to try to get some of the go-to people to increase income? Because in 2007, at a housing conference, it was said that you have to make $12.57 an hour, and they're still asking people to work for $10 an hour. So how do you propose to increase the income to do the affordability to help on that pie that you had talked about.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely
And
critical.
membership.
It's absolutely critical, and it was on our list as one of the critical issues. For the purpose of that initiative, we took it off. We said that is not something we are committed to solving in this 10-month process. And there is a whole other task force that is working on that exact issue. But that was, I mean, and this is a little in the weeds, but that was about how we organized ourselves to say, what can we, the people in this room, meaningfully, influence over this period of time. I mean, I am 100% with you. You could make a very compelling argument. We do not have an affordable housing problem. We have an economic problem. And that was purposefully left out of the House ATL process, and recognize that that's a whole nother body of work that is critical, but was not part of that narrow focus area.
How much is your membership, and what you said you meet 2 times a year? So when's the next time you guys meet,
Right.
and how much is your membership?
So House ATL is an open task force. There is no membership. You show up to the task. You show up to a meeting. You're on the time. We met.
Well, you do have to work. You don't just show up.
You have to show up and contribute. Thank you, Bill. So it was, it's truly anyone who wants to be part of it. We met monthly for those 10 months, and then we'll be meeting, I think it is January 12th. I can get you the specific date. We meet at the Gathering Spot, which is on the west side in the city. And then we'll meet again in June, although we haven't picked that date. But the purpose of those meetings is to hold ourselves accountable to advancing on those 23 recommendations. By coming back, you're saying, I will commit to advance one or more of these recommendations. And so, I mean, more are welcome, but you're gonna help do the lift. But anyone's welcome to the task force meetings, no membership required.
Let me make this point again. We don't work in silos. So where we talked about the catalyst work at ARC, those are connecting those issues. This is work on a particular piece of affordable housing. So we're all aware we've got to work on all these things at the same time.
I'll give a quick plug to this though. As we've looked across the country on the issue of ADUs, one of the major issues is having things that people can do quickly and in a cost-effective way, right? So San Diego ended up, if they hired someone like Eric's firm, that'd be brilliant, taking 6 approved plans, each with like 10 different facades that you could do that anyone knew they could walk in and it'd be permitted and they could do it immediately because there was such a barrier to actually getting it through the process. So I do not work for them. They do not pay me. They do the best work out there. So, great resource to making sure you're making that an efficient process.
Have you calculated what the cost of making everything accessible would do to the affordability and to the cost of the projects?
We've done a fair amount of accessible and affordable housing in New Orleans and through renovation. So what I will say is it's so much easier in new construction to make it accessible. I want to say if you're building new, you've got extra space that you're trading off really in the bathrooms. Hard cost though, if it's $100,000 for a very small ADU, you're probably talking about 10% is probably the cost of accessibility, maybe 6 or 7% depending on where you're going for in terms of some specific bathroom and kitchen functionality. Wider doors, it's not that hard to go accessible, but you've got to be thinking about it with every step of the way, and that's if you're planning for it from the beginning and not trying to modify at the end. That's when it gets expensive.
All right, we're just going to do a couple more. Shelley?
Hi, Sarah. Thanks so much for being here. Thank you for your leadership in the region and also for House ATL. It was a joy to be part of it under your leadership, so thanks. House ATL was just within the boundaries of the city of Atlanta, which our city bumps up against, and unfortunately we can't share some of those resources at the moment. But what do you say to small cities that are either right up adjacent to the city of Atlanta, or at least closer in the metro Atlanta area? What would you recommend us as a small city to take the lessons learned from House ATL in terms of us coming up with a strategic housing policy initiative, strategy, to implement all the resources you had were at a smaller scale, what would you recommend to us?
I am just one person, but from the experience of House ATL, how critical it is to, as we talked about, bring that broad diversity of folks together, from advocacy, nonprofit, for-profit, public sector, so forth, which, you've got a great representative group here, so great start. Focus on things that you can have a meaningful impact on, right? So there's some philosophical things about what that you can influence. I think what's so critical is the fact that you do abut the city and how that creates opportunities, right? But I think there's a couple things that we did that were unique as well, which were to specifically talk about community retention, or I think a more positive way of saying not having displacement. Those are two conversations that we have typically separately: displacement issues and affordable housing strategies, and helping bring together that they have to work together, right? That having new development, that whether it includes affordability or not, how it's going to intersect with the neighborhood where folks are, and then the homelessness issue. Those were two things that were very new to integrate into an affordable housing discussion. I could probably go on and on, but I honestly, there's not something magical about what we did with House ATL, except for a commitment to work together, a commitment to find things we could agree on, having a deadline, and having people who are waking up every day and saying, we're gonna work towards this. And that was, a handful of us who, met every Monday. I mean, this is silly stuff, right? But we've met every Monday for the last year to make sure that we are, it's process, right? I've said lots of times, leadership is not a person, it is not, a grandiose idea, it is a process, and everyone is part of that process, and that's truly, I'm not trying to, stump here, but I think that's what makes the difference, is that commitment to the process, the commitment to the deadlines, and then saying, if you are here, you are committing to be part of the solution. This is not, pointing fingers, and this is not to be combative. This is say we can find what we can agree on and move forward together.
All right,
I wanted to ask about this dilemma. A friend who wasn't able to be here, who's trying to build an ADU, budgeted for it, but then discovered the sustainability rules, policies in the city of Decatur were going to add $30,000 onto her project, which made it out of the question for her. How do you balance those?
Was it road to hell and good intentions? That's what zoning is, basically, in a nutshell. And so people that write rules so often have no sense of the cost of the regulations they're implementing, right? And I will say right now that the International Energy Code, which you have to abide by in Georgia, is very strict and very reasonable as a baseline. To require more than that of your citizens as a stick without any kind of carrot to go along with it is ridiculous.
There you go, folks. Kronberg, Sarah Kirsch, please give them a hand.